History as it happens, December 23, 2021. The end of the USSR.
They are the focus of evil in the modern world. To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire. To simply call the arms...
I have been a real skeptic about Mr. Gorbachev, but I am increasingly persuaded that he's real in terms of his determination to make changes inside.
The maxim is, doviai no proviai. Trust but verify.
After 6.5 years in power, Mikhail Gorbachev confirmed his resignation on
tricolor banner of the Russian Republic now flies over the Kremlin.
Every American can take pride in this victory, from the millions of men and women who've served our country in uniform to millions of Americans who supported their country in a strong defense under 9 presidents.
On Christmas Day 30 years ago, the Soviet Union went extinct. Born from revolution in 1917, it dominated Eurasia for more than 70 years. Its collapse was not inevitable, but it was astonishing. The disintegration of a superpower that once vied with the United States in a global ideological struggle. Let's talk about why it happened and why the USSR is missed. Yes, missed by many Russians today. That's next as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Well, most Russians take a very dim view indeed of Gorbachev. That's partly because he's blamed for the breakup of the Soviet state, which most Russians regret. It's partly because he's blamed for what happened in the 1990s, whereas in fact he was a critic of what was happening under Yeltsin, but by that time he had no power.
I don't remember exactly what I was doing on Christmas Day, 1991, but I'm pretty sure I wasn't paying attention to the news. I was 16 years old. And definitely not Russian television.
Вашу мудрость и силу духа. Мы наследники великой цивилизации. И сейчас от всех и каждого зависит.
Mikhail Gorbachev announced he was stepping down as Soviet president. The red flag, the hammer and sickle, would no longer fly over the Kremlin, an end that Gorbachev himself could not have foreseen when he sought to reform the communist system in order to preserve the Soviet state when he took power in 1985. And I don't remember watching President Bush on TV either that day, declaring victory.
And Merry Christmas to all Americans across our great country. During these last few months, you and I have witnessed one of the greatest dramas of the 20th century, the historic and revolutionary transformation of a totalitarian dictatorship, the Soviet Union, and the liberation of its peoples. That confrontation is now over. The nuclear threat, while far from gone, is receding. Eastern Europe is free. The Soviet Union itself is no more. This is a victory for democracy and freedom. It's a victory for the moral force of our values.
Looking back on it now, it seems to have been inevitable. I mean, how could the sclerotic, corrupt, repressive Soviet state carry on much longer, right? Well, it could have, but Gorbachev evolved from reformer to transformer, and he refused to clench his fist to save the USSR.
His own view becomes more radical that he does actually want to dismantle the communist system. He is really converted to a social democratic version of socialism.
Archie Brown is Emeritus Professor of Politics at Oxford University, an expert on the USSR, and he is our guest today. Our conversation is coming up in a moment. So, Mikhail Gorbachev, how much credit or blame can be assigned to a single person when it comes to something as momentous, as enormous as the collapse of the Soviet Union? Well, here in the United States, some folks say Ronald Reagan brought down the USSR. Reagan helped de-escalate the Cold War, his finest accomplishment, in my view. Gorbachev ended Soviet communism, unintentionally at first. He also is largely responsible for the dissolution of the Soviet state, something he did not want to happen. He tried and failed to secure a democratic union among Russia and the former Soviet republics. So what was viewed as a ringing victory for humanity by George H.W. Bush 30 Christmases ago turned out to be a deeply disillusioning, disappointing story for most Russians, as their nation was plundered by oligarchs, their democracy subverted during the pivotal 1990s, a decade that ended with Vladimir Putin in power, a man who also laments, resents the end of his country's superpower status, even if he and most of his countrymen shed no tears for communism's demise as an economic system. Oxford's Archie Brown is the author of superb books on this subject. In 2009, he published The Rise and Fall of Communism, and his most recent work is The Human Factor: Gorbachev, Reagan, and Thatcher and the End of the Cold War. It was awarded the prestigious Pushkin House Book Prize in 2021. Archie Brown, welcome to the podcast.
Glad to be here.
When I talked to Ian Kershaw a few weeks ago about the anniversary of German reunification, I mentioned this anecdote to him. I'll share it with you. It's more of a memory than an anecdote. When I was a boy in suburban New Jersey in the mid-1980s, I remember looking up at the huge world maps pinned to the classroom walls. The USSR seemed so gigantic and permanent and menacing. You look at the calendar today, and it's been gone for 30 years. Hard to believe, isn't it? Before we get into some of the specifics, I'm interested in what you're thinking as this anniversary approaches.
Well, empires don't usually last forever. I'm old enough to remember looking at maps when I was a small boy, and there was a British empire that was covering a large part of the globe, and that's disappeared. So it's not totally surprising that the Soviet empire, if we call it that, should go, but when it went was a surprise, and it could have lasted very much longer.
It wasn't really around for that long when you look at the scope of history and the sweep of history, less than 1 century. But before we get to the end, I would like to start at the beginning without going over the entire history of the USSR in a short podcast. But some context to start, the idea upon which the USSR was founded. And that was to create a society of workers, an alternative to capitalism. And that was a big deal in 1917, right?
It was, but there were different views of socialism. There was a democratic socialist movement, which had a lot of support in Western Europe. And there have been many countries in Western Europe that have had governments that call themselves socialist, but competed in fair elections. But the Communist Party in the Soviet Union was a very different kind of party. I mean, they believed that they had all the answers, and that communism and what they called socialism would be a dictatorship of the proletariat, a workers' dictatorship. But actually, the dictatorship would be carried out by a small minority who belonged to the Communist Party, and that party itself was highly centralized. So it was very far from being even a democracy of workers. And eventually this would give way to a classless society, the stage of full communism. So they didn't call it a communist system, they called it a socialist system. But their definition of socialism was very different from that of socialist parties of a social democratic type in Western Europe.
And it was based on Marx's stage theory of history, where a society really had to go through capitalism first. I mean, Marx, he would not have expected a peasant society to make the leap toward socialism or communism. And communism was the end point, or the fourth stage, right?
It wasn't really a very appropriate society from a Marxist point of view. The proletariat, the working class, was quite small. It was an 80% peasant country, as you say. But Lenin greatly influenced Marxist doctrine. I mean, they called it Marxism-Leninism after Lenin died. And his view was that you could speed up history, and the Communist Party, the Bolsheviks, as they called them, could take power, and they would create a proletariat, and they would build a socialist system.
Communism would also have to be exported to other countries, right, whose people sought liberation from imperialism and capitalism, right?
Well, they did believe that socialism, communism would triumph worldwide. They weren't necessarily thinking in terms of imposing it themselves. They were thinking rather that there would be spontaneous risings of the proletariat in the more advanced Western countries, where, according to Marxist theory, the revolution should have taken place, where there was a large working class. And so they hoped that workers in Western countries would be inspired by the Soviet example. And a very limited extent, some of them were, but not very much.
So the idea of creating a new kind of society, a worker society, at what point did Soviet leaders give up on this idea? In other words, when did Soviet leaders realize, okay, we're not moving along the road toward a socialist or communist utopia. We're not going to achieve the ultimate aim of the October Revolution. Therefore, we need to hold on to power, pretend to believe in this totalist ideology in the meantime, and try to make the best of a bad situation for our people.
Well, George Orwell coined the term doublethink, and so there was a lot of doublethink going on. I think it'd be wrong to say that these Soviet leaders were just being totally hypocritical, that they themselves were running the country. They had tremendous power, and the average worker had very little power. But nevertheless, they believed that their workers were better off than those in capitalist countries, not necessarily materially, but they were more respected. And if you looked at the Soviet newspapers, there were lots of workers on the front page, pictures of them and so on. And so there was a lot of lip service to the workers and peasants for that matter. So they could believe one and the same time that, yes, Western countries were ahead of them in many ways, but they were catching up. And indeed, they did have very fast economic growth in the Soviet Union in Stalin's time. So I think they didn't necessarily believe in this final stage of communism, the classless society, though they paid lip service to it. But I think they did believe that they were in some way overtaking the West, at least up until Nikita Khrushchev's time. Maybe he was the last person to really be a true believer. And after that, they were a bit more of a status quo power.
So Khrushchev, followed by Brezhnev. And would you agree that at this point, Brezhnev's time, I guess that was the mid-60s to the early 1980s, the idea of reaching communism had been dropped, even though they were maybe paying lip service to it?
I think that's true, yes. I think that they didn't really believe that this final stage of communism, a classless society, would be reached. They were pretty satisfied with what they'd got. I mean, basically the Brezhnev belief was, we must preserve party control within the Soviet Union and our hegemony within Central and Eastern Europe, preserve what we've got. I don't think they were much of an expansionist power anymore. The kind of vision of a Khrushchev, not to speak of a Lenin, that had largely gone.
All right, so why don't we go into the 1980s now? Brezhnev rules until his death in 1982. As you mentioned, his rule is remembered for stability, also for stagnation. In what state was the USSR's economy in upon Brezhnev's death in 1982? His two successors die, and Gorbachev takes power in 1985. So what was the economy like?
Well, the Soviet economy had really slowed down a lot. The economic growth rate was about 2%. And technologically, they were, apart from the military industrial complex, they were falling further behind, not only behind the West, but further behind the newly industrializing countries in Asia. So the economy was certainly not in good shape. But at the same time, the country wasn't in crisis. There was no unrest. People accepted what they got. The penalties for dissent or opposition were quite severe, but the country could have chugged along for a lot longer, many years longer.
Well, it's been said that unrest begins once people's expectations are raised, and there was no reason for them to be raised under Brezhnev. So he dies, and each of his two successors dies, one after another. Neither of them was really interested in reform either.
Well, Brezhnev was succeeded by Yuri Andropov, and Andropov was quite popular. He instilled more discipline, and people felt there had been too much corruption under Brezhnev, and Andropov was very much anti-corruption. There was a slight improvement in the economy under Andropov. So there was a certain amount of optimism, but he didn't last very long. He was very ill. So he was then succeeded by Konstantin Chernenko, who was a very boring bureaucrat, probably the most boring leader the Soviet Union ever had. And he lasted just a little over a year before he died. So then Mikhail Gorbachev comes along, the youngest member of the Politburo. And at that time, people do become a bit optimistic about the prospects of change, though the amount of change that occurred was far in excess of what they ever imagined.
That's right. As you write in your book, The Rise and Fall of Communism, during Chernenko's short time as ruler, you said the views of all the other Politburo members were known. None of them were real reformers, other than Gorbachev. So why was Gorbachev chosen?
Well, that's a good question. It was partly that Andropov picked him out as the ablest member of the Politburo, the person he wanted to succeed him, because he really thought he could get the country moving again. Now, if he realized how far Gorbachev was prepared to go in political change, he certainly wouldn't have given him the backing he did. But he put him into a position within the party leadership where he had a lot of power already. He was supervising large parts of the Central Committee apparatus. And so in a sense, he took the initiative. He was voted for by the Politburo, but when Chernenko died, he was the first person to be notified that Chernenko died, and he himself convened a meeting of the Politburo, and he took the chair. Other members of the Politburo would have had to take a big political risk if they're going to say, why are you chairing this meeting? He was already chairing the meeting when Chernenko was too ill to attend. So unless something went very badly wrong for him, unless other members of the Politburo could get together and try to stop his rise, he was the obvious successor. But of course, other members of the Politburo didn't realize how radical Gorbachev would become. Again, if they had realized how far he would go in undermining the pillars of the system, then they would have stopped him. So they may have had their reservations about them, some of them did, but they assumed that he wouldn't really put the system in jeopardy.
As you say in your book, if Chernenko had lived, there probably would have been very little reform. But in 1985, Gorbachev was not radical at that point, right? He was still a committed communist, or at least committed to trying to save the system?
Gorbachev in 1985 was a communist reformer. He wanted to improve the system. He certainly didn't want to totally replace the system. The thing about Gorbachev is that he had a remarkably open mind, I would say, for any leading politician, and certainly for a communist leader, quite remarkably so. And his own views evolved even while he was holding the highest office within the country. So in 1985, he wanted to reform the system. By 1988, he'd come to the conclusion that the system basically had to be replaced rather than merely reformed.
Replace the system, but not necessarily get rid of the Soviet state, right? He did not want to see the USSR go away.
Naturally, he wanted to preserve the Soviet state, and at that time, I would say also he was not such a radical economic reformer. He wanted some economic reform, but it was very, very late in the day that he embraced the idea that essentially it had to become a market economy. But by 1988, he wanted to not only liberalize but democratize the political system. And in 1988, he announced there would be contested elections for a new legislature, which would take place by the spring of 1989. And indeed they did.
At this point, no one really sees the end coming. I don't think anybody in the world predicted the Soviet Union would be gone in 1991, and it could have carried on.
What people didn't predict was that a Soviet leader would take the risk of pluralizing the system. I wrote a paper for Margaret Thatcher when she was Prime Minister in 1983, in which I said that Andropov was leader at that time, in which I said that for Andropov and other Soviet leaders, to pluralize the system would be to risk anarchy and disintegration. And this has some plausibility in the multinational Soviet state. So what we didn't expect was that a Soviet reformer would go so far as to have contested elections. And once you've got contested elections, people in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they can elect people who are going to defend the national cause and ask for more autonomy for their republics and so on. That was the surprise, that a Soviet reforming leader would go so far as to democratize the system, and then the multinational Soviet state was really in some danger of disintegration.
Why is multi-party pluralism antithetical to communist rule? I guess that question kind of answers itself, doesn't it? Because the communist Soviet Union was a one-party authoritarian state.
It's possible that a smaller Soviet Union could have been preserved. It would still be the largest country in the world. Even Russia today is the largest country in the world. But to the extent you democratized, it's hard to believe that Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the three Baltic states, would have wished to remain within that state. The greater part of the Soviet Union could have been held together, and Gorbachev tried to do it on a voluntary basis, seeking a new union agreement and by negotiation with the republics. The main reason that didn't happen was because of Boris Yeltsin. And Yeltsin's rivalry with Gorbachev was such that he said that Russian law had supremacy over Soviet law. Well, Russia occupied 3/4 of the territory of the Soviet Union. If you started demanding Russian independence from the Union, then there could be no union. But in my view, and in the view of many Russians, it was hardly in Russia's national interest to undermine the Union, because the Union was in some sense a greater Russia.
Two words I remember from my childhood: perestroika and glasnost. But beyond openness and reform, you write that Gorbachev had no specific plan on how to fix the economy. What was going on there?
No, he had no specific plan because there were different economists coming up with different ideas. He realized that there needed to be some decentralization, some market elements, but he essentially wanted to combine a command economy with a bit of marketization, not a fully fledged market system. And after all, the Soviet Union had become a great industrial power under his command economy. It worked after a fashion. And the other thing is that the economy was really under the day-to-day control of the chairman of the Council of Ministers, a man called Nikolai Ryzhkov. And Ryzhkov was a technocratic reformer at most. He wasn't a radical economic reformer. And so for the first 5 years, he was the major influence on what happened in the economy. There was a whole ministerial system. Most Soviet ministries were in charge of different parts of the Soviet economy. So there was a huge institutional interest in the system as it was. So it wasn't easy to reform radically the economic system of the Soviet Union.
To what extent did Gorbachev's travels influence his approach to policy once he was in power? He was in Western Europe traveling earlier in life, and he saw the difference in the living standards, right? The Soviet Union really never figured out how to make consumer goods, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Gorbachev certainly was influenced by his foreign travel. Even in the 1970s, he had short visits to West European countries. And in the 1980s, before he was Soviet leader, he visited Canada as well as Britain. And all these visits had a big impact on him. Of course, he noticed the higher standard of living in the West, and he also noticed the greater freedom with which people spoke. And when he went in a Soviet delegation, they all were having to say the same thing in the 1970s, whereas the Westerners would disagree with each other in his company. And all that made an impression on him. And so he knew, of course, that you needed economic reform in the Soviet Union. But the precise nature of that economic reform, he wasn't clear about that. He wasn't an economist. And he wasn't attracted by the kind of economy that Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher favoured. An economy in which there was extreme inequality and you relied on economic growth and supposedly everybody would be better off. He was more impressed by the social market economy, as it was called in Germany, in West Germany, and by some of the Scandinavian countries with a social democratic form of market economy. But how to get from a Soviet command economy to that kind of economy, that was the difficult thing. And Soviet economists were not very helpful in giving him useful guidance.
And his reforms failed.
Yeah, the economic reform was not very radical at all, and the kind of reform was introduced did in some ways more harm than good. There was massive political reform, and some people thought Gorbachev was introducing political reform merely so he could introduce economic reform, but actually the political reform took precedence over economic reform, and so the economy was going from bad to worse in the last years of the Soviet Union.
So it's become an axiom among some American conservatives that Ronald Reagan compelled the collapse of the USSR by getting the Soviets into an arms race that they could not afford, and it all fell apart. I think that overstates the case to a great degree. But Gorbachev recognized that the Soviet Union was, even before Ronald Reagan became president of the United States, Soviet Union was spending too much money on the military, and he wanted to get the country out of Afghanistan, the Soviet invasion in 1979. So why don't we talk about foreign policy a little bit here? His ideas were radical insofar that he wanted to end the Cold War and end this idea of foreign policy being used as a tool of class warfare. Am I getting that right?
I don't think that Soviet foreign policy was being used much as a tool of class warfare. I mean, class may have been part of the language in which they couched their foreign policy, but essentially they were acting in what they thought was their national interest. Gorbachev, yes, did want to reduce the arms burden on the Soviet economy, but the Soviet Union could have continued for a long time competing militarily with the United States. Because if you're a highly authoritarian system, then, people have to put up with low living standards. And so the fact that the military burden was quite great in the Soviet economy, it could be borne for a very long time. It's not true that it was Ronald Reagan's policy that forced change in the Soviet Union. Ronald Reagan, after all, overlapped with 4 Soviet leaders, Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko, and Gorbachev. And absolutely nothing changed in Soviet foreign policy or changed in a radical way in Soviet domestic policy until Gorbachev became Soviet leader.
So what do you believe Reagan's role was in de-escalating the Cold War? I think that's one of Reagan's finest accomplishments, that he was willing to work with Gorbachev and vice versa to de-escalate tensions.
Yes, I think that some of the people who say that Reagan forced the Soviet Union to change by increasing arms expenditure are actually missing the point of what Reagan did. It was when Reagan turned to engagement with the Soviet Union that progress began to be made. And in 1983, in the course of 83, it was a contradictory year because on the one hand, you had Reagan introducing his Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, which worried the Soviet leadership. And in the same month, in March 1983, he called the Soviet Union an evil empire.
Let us be aware that while they preach the supremacy of the state, declare its omnipotence over individual man, and predict its eventual domination of all peoples on the earth, they are the focus of evil in the modern world. To ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil.
And so there were people who, in Western Europe as well as in the Soviet Union, who thought that Reagan was making the Cold War a great deal colder. And indeed, it was becoming colder in 83. But before the end of that year, Reagan, I think, had been persuaded that, yes, it was becoming dangerously cold. And one of the things that changed was that Jack Matlock had succeeded Richard Pipes as the main advisor on the Soviet Union within the National Security Council in Washington. And whereas Pipes had been very skeptical about the idea of engagement with the Soviet Union, Matlock was very much in favor of engagement. And George Shultz, of course, as Secretary of State, was in favor of engagement. So, as we know, the Reagan administration was very divided. The Defense Department were skeptical about any prospects for better relations with the Soviet Union. The CIA were also skeptical. Well, lower down, there were people with different views, but Robert Gates, the leading specialist on the Soviet Union in the CIA, again, was just as skeptical as Weinberger or Richard Perle. So there were changes in the balance of power, I would say, within the administration. And Reagan, from the end of 83, 84, began to be more willing to consider engagement with the Soviet Union. But it was only when Gorbachev became Soviet leader that he had a leader he could actually usefully engage with.
It takes 2 leaders who are committed to seeking peace.
Mr. General Secretary, though my pronunciation may give you difficulty, the maxim is, doviai no proviai, trust but verify.
Because there were hardliners in both countries who didn't want that.
This is true that they reinforced each other, that there were the hardliners in the Soviet Union who were, in a way, supported inadvertently by hardliners in the United States.
And Gorbachev was able to work with Reagan even though Reagan held very anti-communist views, even though they didn't see eye to eye on many issues, including SDI, which was a Reagan fantasy, but the Soviets apparently took seriously.
The Soviet Union took it seriously for different reasons. Some people thought it might actually work, but the Soviet scientists told Gorbachev it could easily be combated by having missiles with multiple warheads, some of which would have nuclear warheads and some without. And so any system could be absolutely overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of warheads, and there'd be no way that the SDI could distinguish between the multiple warheads, which ones had nuclear payloads and which didn't. Gorbachev's problem with it was that this would mean the Cold War simply continues and intensifies, and he was trying to end the Cold War. So it wasn't because he thought SDI would work in the way in which Reagan hoped it would work, but it would mean that there'd be no end to the Cold War. The people in the military-industrial complex in the Soviet Union, they were glad to use SDI as an excuse, to get more resources rather than have the resources reduced by Gorbachev.
So as the 1980s begin to come to a close, are signs of disintegration evident? And what were they?
Well, once you had contested elections, which you had from 1989, you began to get people elected to the legislature who were wanting more autonomy for their republic, their nation. But it was especially in 1990-91 that you got really strong disintegrative tendencies. And so some people say, well, the Baltic states were the crucial political actors here. Some people say Ukraine. But I think it's more correct to see Russia, paradoxically, as the clue to the complete breakup of the Soviet Union. As I mentioned earlier, Boris Yeltsin played the Russian card against the Union. This was a very odd thing to do because the larger Union would generally be regarded as having been in Russia's interest. But his immediate interest was to get Gorbachev out of the Kremlin and himself into the Kremlin. And so he argued that Russian law had supremacy over Soviet law, and that was a very severe blow to the Union.
So in 1985, when Gorbachev takes power, as you mentioned, he wasn't intending to end communism or the Soviet state. But at some point in his evolution, he seems willing to let that occur. He doesn't use violence to preserve order. He doesn't tighten the clamp again of state repression. Did his outlook totally change from ardent communist to someone willing to just let this system go, this corrupt and inefficient system go?
His own view becomes more radical that he does actually want to dismantle the communist system. He is really converted to a social democratic version of socialism, the kind of socialism of Willy Brandt, who was Chancellor in West Germany. He had conversations with Brandt and he really saw eye to eye with him and with Felipe González, the Spanish socialist prime minister. He was actually more comfortable with them and felt that his mindset had more in common with them than it had with any of the communist leaders in Eastern Europe. So I would say that by 1988-89, he did want to replace the communist system by a democratic system, which would be also social democratic. But of course, at no stage did he want to see the Soviet Union break up. However, then he had a choice between using a lot of force to keep it together or trying to do it by persuasion. And he chose to try to do it by persuasion, by negotiation, by decentralizing, by allowing the republics to take a lot of powers and to have a new agreement and a new kind of federalism. Because the Soviet Union was a kind of pseudo-federal state, and he wanted to turn it into a genuine federal state in which the republics would have a lot of power, but the center, the federal government, would still have sufficient power. In each successive stage of negotiation, the federation, the federal central power, was being left with less and less power. And so eventually there was an attempted coup against Gorbachev because they thought that Gorbachev was giving away far too much.
I was going to ask you about the coup. It fails miserably, right?
It failed, yes, partly because the coup plotters themselves didn't use the violence they could have used in order to succeed. And they accused Gorbachev of being indecisive. They themselves were somewhat indecisive. If they'd been ruthless enough, it could have succeeded, well, at least for a while.
So Christmas Day, 1991, the Soviet Union finally collapses. Gorbachev makes the announcement on television that he is leaving power.
С верой в вас, вашу мудрость и силу духа. Мы наследники великой цивилизации. И сейчас от всех и каждого, чтобы она возродилась к новой, современной.
What an event to happen bloodlessly. I mean, there was some bloodshed in a couple of different instances. But the fact that it ended the way it did, really with a peep. And then in the U.S., President George H.W. Bush goes on television to celebrate the end of the USSR.
This is a victory for democracy and freedom. It's a victory for the moral force of our values.
Well, I don't see the end of the Soviet state as a great cause for celebration. I think the end of a communist system was a cause for celebration. But if Gorbachev could have held together a state by negotiation, by agreement, then who is to say that that would have been a worse outcome than what has happened since? I mean, if you look at the tension between Russia and Ukraine today, which is quite dangerous, if you could have held together a democratized Soviet state, then it was no longer even going to be called the Soviet Union. It was laterally going to be called the Union of Sovereign States. I think on the whole, it was a pity that Gorbachev did not succeed in holding together a kind of union, provided that was a democratic union.
That's a great point, Archie, because the 1990s turned out to be a deeply disappointing decade for Russians and for former citizens of the Soviet Union, with the oligarchs who stole the wealth of this very wealthy nation in terms of natural resources.
The 1990s meant that democracy lost its prestige in Russia, because in the late 1980s, when the Soviet Union was democratizing, there was a lot of enthusiasm for greater democracy in Russia. But people became disillusioned in the 1990s under Yeltsin with what they were told was democracy. They took the view, well, if that's democracy, you know what you can do with it, because they felt the country's great natural resources were being sold off at knockdown prices to pre-selected buyers, which indeed they were. And so that degree of corruption helped to disillusion people with the very idea of democracy.
So can we call Mikhail Gorbachev a great leader? I suppose that's a difficult label to attach to someone who, whether he did it intentionally or not, brought about the end of his nation state and superpower status. I see him as a great leader for what he didn't do. We just talked about it. He didn't use force to maintain order when people wanted to go a different direction. How do you see Gorbachev?
Well, I see him as a transformational leader, and I think that some of the transformation was indeed intended. As I said, he began as a reformer, but then he became a systemic transformer, and he consciously tried to transform the Soviet political system, and indeed he did. What was an unintended consequence was the breakup of the Soviet state. But if the only way the Soviet state could have been held together was by reinstating a highly authoritarian one-party system, then it's to his credit he didn't do that. And it's to his credit he didn't use massive violence in order to hold that state together. So even the breakup of the Soviet state, the way it happened, can be regarded as a positive thing on Gorbachev's ledger.
What's Gorbachev's reputation like today in Russia?
Well, most Russians take a very dim view indeed of Gorbachev. That's partly because he's blamed for the breakup of the Soviet state, which most Russians regret. It's partly because he's blamed for what happened in the 1990s, whereas in fact he was a critic of what was happening under Yeltsin, but by that time he had no power. But in the view of Russians, well, it was his policy that led to that and made that possible. And then, of course, under Putin, it's very hard to publish articles which would be positive about Gorbachev. And so most of what people read or hear about Gorbachev in the mass media is very negative. Now, having said that, there's a minority of Russians who esteem Gorbachev very highly. They recognized that under Gorbachev, Russia became a freer country than it had ever been, and they value those freedoms and his attempt to democratize more than they deplore the downside.
The USSR took on such profound importance to the United States foreign policy, the battle between the ideologies. I think a lot of people in this country don't understand the bitterness among Russians today that you just alluded to. Do you agree with that?
I think a lot of people would be puzzled by the fact that most Russians regret the breakup of the Soviet Union. It doesn't mean they're nostalgic for communism. Some of them are, because there was a kind of job security. In Stalin's time, nobody had real security. But by the Brezhnev period, there was job security. People were not very well paid, but they all had a job. And there was a kind of minimal level of social support. So some of the older generation are nostalgic even for the things that took for granted in the communist period. But I think more people are nostalgic for the larger country, for the superpower status that the Soviet Union had. That prestige mattered to them.
The USSR was not around for very long. Easy for me to say, I did not have to live under its rule, but not even 1 century. And in the scope of history, that's not that much time. Did it have any lasting positive legacy?
Well, some people would argue that Western countries developed welfare states, they developed social services, partly in response to the fear of communism. And there may be, an element of truth in that. I mean, there was strong support among Western political parties, especially in Western Europe, more in Western Europe than in the United States, for these social policies. But probably the fear of communism was also probably a factor. And so you could argue that the kind of economic policies that were pursued in the West after the fall of communism paid less attention to workers, and trade unions became weaker than they were in the communist period, because in the communist period there was a lot of support for democratic trade unionists, for fear of communism. So there is that aspect. But on the whole, of course, communism did vastly more harm than good.
And it would seem that China learned the lesson of the collapse of the Soviet Union, because the Chinese Communist Party is willing to use force to maintain order while it liberalizes its economy. There's been no political liberalization in China.
There are many people in Russia who think that the Soviet Union should have followed the Chinese route. They keep the high degree of political discipline, conformity, and have a marketized economy. And so certainly China's been economically far more successful than Russia. But the price that's paid is a highly oppressive dictatorial political system. And so, it comes down to a question of values. I mean, do you value democracy and freedom more than you value a higher standard of living? Western countries have shown, after all, that it is possible to have both.
And on that note, I also notice among younger leftists in the United States, communism doesn't have or socialism doesn't have the horrible ring to it that it did for my generation and, of course, earlier generations. This idea of socialism as an alternative to rapacious capitalism, it still lives on in the minds of many leftists across the world.
Well, in a way, there's no reason why socialism should not live on as an idea, because what I've tried to emphasize is that there were different kinds of socialism. Socialism meant different things to different people. And in Britain, for example, the Labour Party, which calls itself a socialist party, has been in power several times. In the immediate post-war period, the Labour government, headed by Clement Attlee, created the modern welfare state in Britain, and people respect that. So there are different kinds of socialism. So I would hope that the people you're talking about, it's that kind of socialism they favor, not the kind of socialism favored by Joseph Stalin or even Leonid Brezhnev.
Well, I think most young Americans on the left have things like universal health insurance in mind, not forced collectivization of agriculture. Archie Brown, thank you for your contributions to this field of study. And again, his most recent work is The Human Factor: Gorbachev, Reagan, and Thatcher and the End of the Cold War. On the next episode of History as It Happens, we're going to look to the future of work. A two-part series is on the way as we witness the so-called Great Resignation. As the pandemic persists, what does the workplace have in store for Americans? Robots? Higher salaries? 4-day work weeks? That's next as we report history and the future as it happens. A podcast from the Washington Times.